by my dear colleague and friend, Claudio Lomnitz, who's here, so thanks for co-sponsoring this. It has been a pleasure, and I think it's particularly appropriate that we have this talk about Mexican migration, because for both the Forum of Migration and the Center of Migration. For the Center of Migration, actually, mobility and international migration has been a central element in the historical formation of Mexico. It is actually quite difficult to think of another process that is a central, maybe land redistribution or land ownership. And for the history of mobility, Mexico is also a central component in the history of international mobility. Actually, Mexico represents the largest instance of movement across international frontiers in the history of international migration. The other thing that has happened is that Mexican migration is not only very old, very voluminous, more than any other place, but also is becoming increasingly diverse. It has been becoming increasingly diverse in terms of origins. It used to be mostly border and central origin. Now it's going all the way to the south, to Oaxaca, even Chiapas. More indigenous rather than simply mestizo also, that's another change. More diverse in terms of destinations. It used to go to ex-Mexico, to the southwest, and a little bit to Chicago. Now it's going all over the United States, and actually including to Canada too. I think Mexicans are the second largest Latino group in Canada after Salvadorians. It has been also becoming more diversified in terms of social origins. I was talking to Filiz now and noticing that there is more upper middle class professional migration out of Mexico, what people used to refer to as brain drain. Although in the case of Mexico, it's probably a brain gain because there is a lot of circulation and Mexico is doing quite well economically. And we have the perfect person to talk about that, the diversification of Mexican migration, the diversity of Mexican and US migration. Professor Filiz Garip, she's an associate professor of sociology at Harvard University. Although originally you were electrical engineering or industrial engineer, that's quite a shift. She has been studying and she has written extensively on all sorts of aspects about migration. Remittances, migrant remittances, and the impact that migrant remittances have had on the accumulation of wealth in the home country and also on the distribution of wealth in the home country. The link and the connections between social networks, social capital, and increasing inequality, both within groups, intra-group, but also intergroup between groups. Issues of gender migration, the selectivity of migration in terms of origins, social origins, and also change across time. In that sense, you're also a historian. She's now working on a book. She just told me that it's half finished. That's quite on this issue of the diversity of the diversification, increasing the diversification of Mexican migration to the United States. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. So, as Jose said, I'm working on a book project, and I should have finished by now, but I'm only halfway. So, when I first started writing this book, I called it Why People Migrate. And then people told me that it was really boring, that title. And first it was my mother-in-law. I didn't take that very seriously, and then a lot of my colleagues said the same thing. So I found a new title, Crossing Paths, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. It's actually really great to be able to take a break from writing and to come here and to share some of the findings here with you and get your thoughts on it. I can still change things, you know. So, today there are about 12 million Mexican-born people in the United States, and about half of them are undocumented. So the big questions are, who are these migrants, and why do they come to the US in such great numbers? Now, there's no single answer to these questions. If you think about Mexico and the United States, both are very dynamic societies. If you look at the past 30 years, both societies have changed dramatically. And as they change, the migrants moving between the two countries have also changed. So Jose talked about this a little bit, but let's look at some figures. In the 1970s, 75% of migrants from Mexico to the United States were men. In the 1990s, this dropped to about 65%. So it looked like the migration flow was leading toward gender parity. But then this trend reversed again, and in 2000s, again, we had about 73% men in the migrant flow. Now, in the 1970s, 2/3 of migrants came from the western states. Actually, 5 states in central western Mexico accounted for 2/3 of all migrants to the United States. And they also came from the rural regions in these states. And in the 1990s, these states were now supplying about half of all migrants. And in 2000s, about a quarter. So it's a huge change there. So the migrants also shifted in their destinations in the United States. If you look at the 3 major receiving states in the United States, California, Texas, and Illinois accounted for almost 90% of migrants in the 1970s. And today, about a half. We have new destinations like Arizona, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So basically, what's causing these shifts? This is the major problem that we're trying to address here. The simpler question that I'm asking is, let's think about what determines who migrates from one country to another. Now, a lot of work has been done on this, a lot of theoretical work in multiple disciplines. But if you sort through all the literature in these disciplines, in anthropology, sociology, economics, a few major ideas actually have made a huge impact. So scholars in these disciplines have connected who migrates, this question, to basically 3 different things. They've referred to either individual desires to increase earnings, and this was the economics position. They talked about family strategies to diversify risks to income. And they also talked about social ties that establish over time between migrants here and then Mexicans in Mexico. And they thought about how this became a chain process. So again, there's a historical component to how these theories were developed. In the 1970s, the first idea was actually very much in fashion. Economists at that time was talking about human capital, how everything was about skills, individual skills. And they applied this idea to migration, and they said, well, people in the developing world, they basically evaluate their skills, what their skills are worth in Mexico versus what they would be worth in the United States. And they also consider the costs of migrating. And then if they think that they'll benefit from migrating, if they think they'll come out positive, then they migrate. And their goal is basically to increase their earnings as much as possible. So this was the neoclassical migration paradigm. Migration was about an individual's decision. Now, in the 1980s, a lot of evidence had collected in sociology and anthropology that actually showed migration was a family decision. So a lot of the time, these decisions were discussed in the family, and there was a lot of negotiation as to who should migrate and where. And so they talked about this as a challenge to the existing neoclassical economic paradigm. And economists basically got a hold of this idea as well, and they tried to formulate this mathematically. But the thing is, the formulation came from finance. Risk diversification idea in finance actually was really big in economics at the time. So they basically took this and applied to the migration phenomena. So the idea was this: family is a different unit than the individual because it has multiple members. So different people can do different things. While I stay here, my sister can go and migrate to Germany, let's say. And then this may work out well for the family because we're diversifying the risks each one of us are facing. So this idea came to be known as the new economics of labor migration. So migration was about family decisions and about diversifying risks to income. And especially in the developing world at the time, the risks were plenty. So there were a lot of economic crises in Mexico in the 1980s, and there weren't the market mechanisms to actually manage it. So it fit the context. Now, while this was happening, of course, anthropologists and sociologists were worrying about social ties. So even when you're talking about the family, you can't talk about it as an isolated unit. These families exist in communities where migration becomes established over time. So then these social ties themselves become pull factors. Once you have people from your village who have migrated, you can find out about the opportunities here. And over time, migration even becomes normative. It becomes the thing to do for young adults and has this cultural element. So all these three ideas actually have found evidence over time in the Mexico-US context. So what I'm trying to do here is not to determine, okay, we have these three ideas, which of these ideas works best in the Mexico-US case. What I'm trying to do is take all of these ideas and try to see if they apply to different groups in Mexico and at different time periods. Basically, the main argument is that people may be migrating for different reasons at different times. So when I was first writing the first paper to come out of this project, I thought I had this very complex argument, wrote the paper, sent it off, and then we went on field work to Mexico for 2 months. And one migrant that we were talking to, so we asked him, why do people migrate? And he said this one sentence that completely summarized everything that I had to do in that paper I tried to do. So he said, every person is a different world, they think differently. So what he was trying to convey was people migrate for different reasons. So our job as social scientists is try to understand which groups migrate for which reasons. Now let me step back a little bit. This is not so easy to do if you consider the philosophy of social sciences. So in social sciences, the diagram here is trying to depict the logic. So we're trying to study a phenomenon, an outcome, say why, like migration, right? And we take a typical case and we try to understand what path led that case to that outcome. So what makes an average Mexican person migrate or not? But if we look at our sample, we can actually see different groups, different types of individuals, like the circles or the triangles here. And they may be reaching the same outcome but through different pathways. If we look at the overall population, these different groups may be small in number, but still may be critical for us to understand the phenomenon of migration. So, basically the main argument here, the heart of the argument, is that individuals may reach the same outcome migrating to the US through different pathways, and those pathways may depend on personal circumstances, how you're doing, how your family is doing, what kind of difficulties you're facing, and also on the larger economic, social, and political climate. So now the question is, how do we identify those pathways? How do we decide, what the groups are among Mexican migrants? So I'll briefly describe how I go about it here. So I'm a quantitative sociologist, but for this project I used both a very large survey data and also fieldwork information. So here in the presentation I'll first present the results based on the survey, so the general patterns, and toward the end I'll talk about the qualitative data as well. In the book I'm trying to combine both, but it seemed hard to do in the talk. So the strategy, how do we go about it? So most of the work on Mexico-US migration or any migration behavior, quantitative work, tries to compare migrants and non-migrants. What makes people migrate? What are the differences between an average migrant and an average non-migrant? Are migrants more educated, less educated, poorer, richer? This is the state of most studies. Here I'm not doing that. I'm looking at only migrants. And then, I'm trying to search for different groups among migrants. And these groups, I'm determining based on personal attributes, individual characteristics like education, gender, family wealth, what kind of community they live in, and so on and so forth. And the assumption that I'm making here is that individuals who share similar attributes face similar opportunity structures. Now, if you think about social science research, we actually do this a lot. We tend to study men and women differently to see how, factors affecting their behavior may be different. We look at, different ethnic groups differently. Here what I'm doing is similar, but I'm not just taking one dimension like gender or education. I'm putting a lot of attributes in there, and I'm trying to identify the migrants inductively in this multidimensional space. Now, once I do that, once I discover the groups among migrants, I look at the conditions that set apart each group. under which conditions does each group proliferate, and how do they differ from non-migrants at their time? So it's looking at it from a different, it's coming at it from a different direction, just looking at migrants first, divide them into groups to see if there are different groups out there, and then to see what time period